Dad's on a hunting trip, and he hasn't been home in a few days.
Hi BookTube, I'm here with the first video in my week of supernatural videos. When I talk about supernatural, I am talking about the TV show. Yeah, so in this video, just gonna get right to it, I'm just gonna recommend books for the characters. Things that I think that will help them, and things that I think that they should read just to, have some enjoyment. I just chose Sam, Dean, and Cass, and I'm recommending them each 3 books. A self-help book, a work of fiction, and a horror book, because, of course, why not? So let's begin with Dean. So the first book, a self-help book I'm going to recommend to Dean, is Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. I think the title should be self-evident. I haven't read this book, but I think it would be very helpful to Dean. So let's state a possibly unpopular opinion here. Mary and John were bad parents. The Mary that came back, to be clear, she was a bad parent to Dean and Sam. And John especially was abusive. I mean, just if you watch episode 7, season 9, Bad Boys, where Dean had to steal to feed him and Sam, and then John was just going to let him rot in jail. So he goes to this home, and he's covered in bruises and cuts. And I know John didn't inflict it himself, but his actions led to Dean, a child, getting hurt. He was also parentified into taking care of Sam as well. And I mean, it wasn't Mary's fault that she couldn't be with what her sons wanted her to be when she came back. I mean, she was technically, I believe, younger than the characters were. So she was emotionally not ready to be a parent. So she was an emotionally immature parent, right? So I think that would help Dean heal from a lot of his trauma there. On a lighter note, some fiction. This book's going to come up a lot in the supernatural videos just because it was mentioned by the creator, Eric Kripke himself. So I think Dean might have already read this, but maybe, later season Deans could do for a reread. This is On the Road by Jack Kerouac. So first of all, Kripke has stated that Sam and Dean were named after the characters from On the Road. Their names were Sal and Dean in the book instead, so there's that direct connection. Secondly, it's a classic American book about a road trip. So we got the classic American, the cars, road trips, seems stuff like that Dan would like. And they encounter strange peoples and places, not, outrightly supernatural, but, there's still some unsettling things that happen. I think it'd be super relatable to Dean. And it also feels like his era. Like, Dean is stuck in, like, the 60s and the 70s. I think he'd like to read books from that time. As for horror, I'd recommend Beloved by Toni Morrison. I know it's not a typical horror, but I'd like to see how fast, with his skill set, he'd be able to pick up on the supernatural elements of the story. And I think he'd also appreciate that it's a slower paced book in contrast to like his faster paced lifestyle, but it still contains that link to his interests. On to Sam. Self-help book for Sammy. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. I haven't read this book either, but I haven't read a lot of self-help books, but from what I hear and what I've read about the book, I think this would be a good book for Sam. It's about how trauma affects the brain and the body and ways to heal from that. Sam, I feel, is one of the most traumatized characters on the show. Like, he spent 120 years imprisoned in the cage with Lucifer and Michael, so like he's been physically, sexually, emotionally tortured there. So he's got some trauma to work through. Sam is also interested in physical health a lot. He's interested in taking care of his body and his mind. So I think showcasing how his trauma affects that and ways that he can heal from that physically would be helpful for him. Okay, a work of fiction. Okay, I'm gonna go off some assumptions here. First of all, Sam has probably read a lot of the classics already, is my take. And I'm assuming for some reason he'd like fantasy, but he would already have read a lot of the classic fantasies. So I'm not going to recommend him a classic fantasy, I'm going to recommend him a more modern fantasy, and that is Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James. It's fantasy, but it's not a typical white hetero Western fantasy. And I think it would challenge Sam there. I think he'd also relate to like this kind of weird aspect in the book, and a lot of the world jumping, because we know there's a lot of world jumping in Supernatural. And the supernatural characters would be familiar, but they're with an interesting spin because they aren't things that he's seen in America. And I think you could really learn from it. As for horror, House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danilowski, just because I'd recommend this book to anyone, but I think Sam particularly would like it because Sam is so into like research and delving into things. And I think if anyone could come up with what this book means, if it means anything, it would be Sam Winchester. I also think he'd be able to relate to the relationships the various characters have with each other, you know, and seeing himself in Navidson in particular, I think, and maybe even a little bit in Johnny Truant. Yeah, and he'd also probably be the ultimate, you know, fourth element of the book. And he'd manifest the creature in the house in reality and then actually defeat it. I think that would be a really cool episode. And overall, I think he'd really appreciate the challenge of House of Leaves. And lastly, Cass, dear old Castiel. Yes, I'm recommending a help book to an angel, and that self-help book is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I think this would help Cass better understand mankind and himself, help him understand his purpose and his suffering and mankind's purpose and suffering. I can see this going slightly awry if he doesn't use it to help himself but tries to use it as like a manual to try and help others find their meaning. I think that would be a fun episode to see him trying to go around fixing Sam and Dean and other people he encounters, trying to help them find their purpose, but then in the end learned the overarching lesson that he's the one who needs help with that. I mean, he obviously cares for Sam and Dean and Jack in the later seasons and so many other people, and I feel this would help him feel better and help care for himself as well. Okay, a fiction book. This was the first book that popped into my head when I thought about doing this video, and that's got to be Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. Specifically, this book has to be read in a buddy read with Crowley. This, like, you know, when they're going on their little adventure, they're gonna read this book and talk about it while driving around the country, solving crimes. That would just be so perfect. And it'd be interesting to see if Cass would identify more with like Aziraphale or Crowley, Crowley in the book. And it'd be interesting to hear them banter about it and their takes on it and what it gets right and wrong and angel lore and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And lastly, the horror for Cass. I'm gonna have to go with a classic and go with Frankenstein. I just think he'd be able to relate to the monster and relate to being a creation that doesn't abide by their creator's will. And to strive for love while dealing with the monstrous aspects of your character as well. So I think, yeah, he'd be able to really identify with Frankenstein's monster. So that's it. Let me know if you'd recommend any books to these characters and what they would be. And thank you for watching.
We got work to do.